think the thing about the language of money, I think the reason the language of money is important is that if you don't speak it, you're excluded. It's very, very basic. It's embarrassingly basic, but I know because I was that person that I quite often just literally didn't understand what words meant. Words like fiscal and monetary, you know, I've got a degree. I was, you know, been working as a writer and journalist for decades, and I was in my late 40s before I knew what the difference between fiscal and monetary was. And I think if you don't know these things, you are, there's a form of a subtle but actually really quite important form of exclusion is happening. You're just not taking part in the conversation. I think the fact that money is a kind of specialised language played a role in the credit crunch, quite an important one, but I think that it's also very important in how we got there and where we've ended since. And I think a really crucial part of it was the idea that somehow a lot of these things are self-evident, you know, that the order of politics and economics we've ended up with, which is what they call neoliberal, basically the idea that if you take away rules and regulations, everyone gets richer, and the rich get richer quicker, but we all do better. Rising tide lifts all boats, and then the wealth trickles down. It's a metaphor that I always use. And this is just somehow self-evidently the way it works. And we were very immensely patronising to economies that didn't run like that, sort of patting them on the head, saying, you know, poor little French, poor little Japanese. You know, we know how to do it, you don't. You'll catch up with us one day. And I think the idea that these things were somehow self-evident truths partly came from the fact, allowed us to not think about it as part of it, and also was fueled by the fact that we weren't thinking about it. We weren't putting pressure on, you know, exactly who the winners and losers are. People say things like, we're cracking down on bankers' bonuses. That very precisely means that they're not. We're cracking down on bankers' pay means we're not cracking down on bankers' pay. And I fell to thinking about how often things just sort of meant their opposites in this world. And then it occurred to me that actually it very often happens at the level of language. And I think the simplest and maybe the most consequential of them is just to do with, you know, I grew up with what everyone, you know, it was a middle class thing, and it was also a really powerful thing in working class culture, horror of debt, the idea that debt was a bad thing. You didn't want it. Now, that idea is just like, it's dead as Elvis. I mean, that is just absolutely gone. And I think one of the ways in which the horror of debt was effectively engineered out of the culture was that the word was reversified. We don't have that thing called debt anymore. We have this thing called credit. And whereas debt's a bad thing, you don't want that. But credit is fantastic, and you do want. And effectively, it's just a switch. You know, it's the same thing. We just flipped around the other way. And a lot of words to do with money, like, you know, securitization, which somehow instinctively you think is to do with making things safe, and it's not at all. Hedge funds, which in some weird way, surely it's to do with hedges or things being hedged, and it's not. And it, you know, bailouts. Bailout is taking something out of a sinking thing. Why does that mean pouring public money into a bank, say? So I think you get this curious thing whereby processes of innovation and capitalist coming up with new ideas end up with words just not meaning what it looks like they mean.